welcome back to Wake Up with Nubian Tigers Talk, a podcast brought to you by a group of Black Princetonians, where we explore the issues that are impacting our Black and Brown communities. My name is Michelle Jacobs, and I'm here with my co-host, as always, Ray Smalls. So Ray, the last episode, we had Professor Kenneth Nunn with us, who teaches critical race theory and other race issues based classes at the University of Florida College of Law, because we wanted to establish for our listening audience what critical race theory really
is. A baseline, exactly.
Right. So this week, we have the honor of having two guests with us to talk about what is actually going on the K-12 level. So who do you have lined up for us today?
Well, first, we'd like to welcome to the podcast Janella Hines, who is a 1993 Princeton University graduate with a degree in sociology and a concentration in African-American studies. So Janella worked from 96 to 2004 as a social studies teacher, dean, and conflict resolution specialist at high schools in Central Brooklyn, and later worked as the public policy director of the New York State AFL-CIO. In 2012, she was elected VP of Academic High Schools for the United Federation of Teachers, championing, if I can say that correctly, Ray, equity for students and empowerment for educators in each of the vast array of New York City high schools. And our second guest, former classmate of mine, so I have to say a shout out to class of 78. He is David Adams, and David received his BA magna cum laude from Princeton in 1978, has a master's degree in legal studies from Columbia University, and also his JD from Columbia. David is currently the executive director of the William Casper Graustein Memorial Fund, which is based in Hamden, Connecticut. In David's prior role as executive director of the Oliver Scholars Program, he led the work of helping Black and Latinx students from New York City gain admission to and navigate the private school arena for 8 years. So Janella and David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So Janella, we'll go to you first. As a New York State Public Schools administrator, the administration last spring implemented a culturally responsive and sustainable framework to offer a blueprint for school districts to individually review and amend their programs and policies to meet the needs of an increasingly multicultural student population. Please explain what this means and what all of that entailed.
So, Ray, I am a high school social studies teacher, and what the union that I represent, the United Federation of Teachers, where I'm also the vice president for high schools, we have a teacher center. The teacher center is our pedagogical wing of our union, and they focus a lot of effort and energy on how our educators will grow professionally. So we've spent a lot of time really thinking about the culturally responsive framework. Goldie Muhammad, the author of Cultivating Genius, has really been the architect of the model that's being used in New York City. And we have aligned much of our professional learning to her framework so that our educators will be successful in the classroom, whether they're in pre-K or they're teaching 12th grade. And for the most part, our members have been very receptive to thinking about how to redesign instruction so that they are meeting the whole needs of their students. We have had some pushback, in a system where you have 80,000 teachers, and that is separate and apart from all the other professionals that are in the classroom. Of course, there's going to be some percentage that has a very traditional line of thinking about teaching. They are focused on the chalk and talk. They want to be the ones doling out all of the learning to these receptive sponges who bring nothing to the classroom. But I think more and more of our members respect the value of our students' cultural backgrounds and their experiences and what they bring to the classroom and how we can co-create a learning experience together.
Janella, you mentioned pushback. What did that pushback look like, and what happened?
2 chancellors ago, because New York City has seen quite a bit of change with regard to the leadership of our Department of Education. 2 chancellors ago, there was a lot of talk about implicit bias, and there were required courses that needed to be taken by all in-service educators. And there were also frameworks where people were talking about teaching tolerance, and people were talking about the biases that they brought into the classroom. And some people were very thoughtful about that and thought about how they could reflect on the ways in which they bring themselves to the classroom and whether or not they are using gender as a reason to ostracize students, or income, or disability, right? And of course, race, right? Like that, of course, race is going to be part of that. But there were some members in particular areas who were not trying to hear that, who were very, very uncomfortable with that, and who expressed their concerns to the union. They were not the majority, but they were incredibly vocal and persistent in expressing their frustration about these mandates being rolled out.
So that's an interesting point, Janelle, and we didn't prepare this question, but it certainly is generated by what you said. And a lot of the implicit bias work, it's clear that once people get exposed to the concept of implicit bias, they have their reactions one way or the other. But the research is showing that just the exposure to the idea of implicit bias doesn't necessarily change the behavior. So I'm wondering if you see that too. And 1 and 2, the ones who were vocally resisting, what ended up happening? Are they still irritants in the system, or have they finally discovered that they have to toe the line? What's happening there?
So I'll answer the second question first. I think the Chancellor, Richard Carranza, was a catalyst for a lot of ethnocentrism and racism to express itself in our system. And because he was so vocal in his desire to uproot systems that harmed immigrant students, students of color, low-income students, and was unapologetic about it, there were people who, from the outset, said, oh, absolutely not. We got questions like, well, now that there is a Mexican-American chancellor, does that mean that white people are not going to get promotions anymore?
Oh, heaven forbid. Heaven forbid.
Imagine. So, and when you unpack that and you say to people, well, what evidence do you have to support that question? No, it's just the point. It's just the point. And it's interesting because we don't see that same kind of energy with our current chancellor, who is a Black man, and the chancellor that immediately preceded him, who is a Black woman, the first Black woman chancellor. Part of that could be style. Part of that could be the fact that they're both native New Yorkers, whereas Carranza came from outside, right? So there's this outsider thing that New York teachers didn't really vibe with. But there was incredible pushback to his agenda, and how unapologetic he was, how vocal he was about his agenda. Those members, many of those members are still in the system. The structures and the thrusts that were in place under Carranza, of course, shifted with new chancellors. And so other priorities were elevated. The implicit bias work is still there. The teaching tolerance work is still there. The cultivating genius work is there. But it is not being led by someone who is coming in ready to thump, like the previous chancellor, I think, was.
No,
And I say that with admiration. Like, I enjoyed working with him. I thought we worked well together, and I appreciated what he was saying. So I don't say that negatively. I just giving that caveat.
yeah, no, it's because it's difficult, right? When people are unapologetic about demanding inclusion and equity, that does ruffle feathers, whether you're an insider or an outsider, and even people who would benefit from that inclusion get nervous because it does make others nervous about how you're approaching the subject. So yeah, that's not surprising at all. But let me ask you, since you raised the resistance question, are your teachers hearing from parents that there's resistance to any kind of change in the curriculum? Because obviously last episode we had Professor Nunn on, who is in a state that's highly resistant to any positive mention of students of color in terms of the development of American history. So have you, and we know New York City is thought to be liberal, but there's always Staten Island. And the rest of them, I'll just call it out. And the rest of the state. So what kind of experiences have you been?
Is Staten Island still a part of New York City? I don't remember.
It shouldn't be if it is, but whatever.
One of my closest friends is a Staten Islander, born and bred. And when I first met her, I was like, for real? They really?
I'm sorry, I take it back.
So the Black community on Staten Island is active and engaged, and
yes,
and has been doing incredible work. I will just say District 31 has been doing incredible work around these issues, right? These educators are coming to the table and talking about race in a forthright and direct manner in a place where you'd think that wouldn't happen. Mm-hmm. And so it's been really phenomenal to watch the ways in which Staten Islanders, Black, white, Latino, immigrant, and native born have been talking about these issues in places in a way that is much more productive than it's happening in other more progressive parts of the city. New York City is different from so many other places because it is so segregated. So that's one piece of it. It's incredibly segregated. But the other piece of it is we have a majority minority, I hate that word, but we have a majority ethnic minority system. So families who are white families, they tend to be in schools where they are with white teachers and other white students. In certain communities, you'll have some pretty substantive diversity happening in District 2 in Lower Manhattan. There are some areas of Brooklyn, there are some areas of Queens where you do have diversity, but it's a very, very segregated city. And so under the guise of empowerment, which was ushered in about 20 years ago under Mayor Bloomberg, school communities do have a lot of freedom and flexibility around how they're going to roll out these educational initiatives. And I'm sure you can imagine particular school leaders are going to put their energy in places where they think their school community is.
Yeah, no, both Ray and I were born and raised in New York, and
right on.
Yes.
My elementary school was, I don't even remember ever seeing a white person in my elementary school. I didn't see that until I went to an IGC class down in another part of Manhattan. So yeah, I often tell people, New York, it looks like the city of love and all that, but it's extremely segregated based on residential choices. And so, yeah, your response is not surprising there. So we're gonna come back to you, Janelle, in a little bit, but I'm gonna swing over to David. And David, you have experience in both New York State and in Connecticut, working with education, labor, and public policy. So your foundation now says on its website that it's fighting to bring equity to education. So let's start with, what does that mean?
Certainly. One of the things that we've been unpacking really from the inception of the mission is exactly what that means. And so we're looking at a variety of things that are about both opportunity for all students, and especially for BIPOC students in the state, because Connecticut is pretty notorious for the opportunity gaps here, for the segregation, for the disparities in school funding. And so, we're looking at, all those dynamics, as well as the opportunity to, have a student be taught by someone who looks like them, which is a huge problem in the state of Connecticut. And so we really try to look at all the dimensions, because equity is really showing up in a variety of ways. And the most glaring ones are obviously the resource disparities, the opportunity to really address the problems that students bring into the school building with them, because your ability to function effectively as a student is going to be affected by what's going on in your life. And so the schools have to have the ability to address that as well. So we look at both what happens inside of the school building, inside of the school system, as well as what's happening around students in their lives and how those issues get addressed.
Right. We found, particularly for Black girls, that a lot of the disciplinary expulsions and suspensions that they receive in school are actually rooted in things that they're dealing with outside of school, like getting brothers and sisters to where they need to go, feeding, picking up, taking care of siblings, housing insecurity, etc. And that schools aren't really paying attention to that when they lash out to discipline these girls. But I was spending a little bit of time on the Graustein website. That's a fascinating little 25th anniversary video you have up there. So one of the questions we had was, with this pushback, and Connecticut got into the news, right? Because somebody who was running for a school board made a statement in the newspaper that if they taught Black children the culturally inclusive history, white kids would feel bad. And so, wow, that's right there in your state. So one of the questions we have is, how are you experiencing that kind of pushback, and how is it impacting your ability to actually get your work done?
It's interesting how it shows up. So there are going to be, sort of those pockets of resistance and pockets of, fear, which I think is what is underlying that, hit everywhere. It has not coalesced into a sort of statewide movement, and frankly, has not even taken over, a particular town in that kind of sort of proactive way. That particular news story revolved around an attempt to elect a school board slate around that agenda, and they actually lost, pretty decisively. But you do have, that concern. I think the more pressing issue is really the way in which Connecticut is structured makes it difficult to really do anything proactive around these issues. So the resistance is less of an issue as much as the structural barriers are. The fact that you have parents and maybe even, a few teachers that are not comfortable with that is obviously a concern. But, when you're trying to get the system to be more culturally responsive, you have to work your way through 169 towns, 169 school boards for a state that has less than 4 million people, right? And what happens is, there's complacency in the overwhelming majority of the school districts that are overwhelmingly white and don't really have any sort of local pressure to deal with that. And that fragmentation of Connecticut's, sort of political structure takes a lot of the pressure off of the statewide elected officials, because, they can pretty much say, well, yeah, that's up to the school board. And then if the town itself is 97, 98% white, there's not going to be any local pressure on that school board.
Right. Contrasting that to listening to what Janella was saying about how much more progressive New York City is. Well, I mean, you've been in New York for a number of years. Your children went to school in New York. David, what are the different? How have you observed how New York got things done versus how Connecticut is addressing these issues?
Yeah, it's a great question because it hit me after I had been here for a while that in some ways I was kind of spoiled because, I'm a city kid. I grew up in the South Side of Chicago. I practiced law in Detroit, and then I've lived in New York City and frankly, Harlem for most of my adult life. And when I got to Connecticut, I realized that things that I had taken for granted, one, diversity,
right.
Two, was a much more empowered BIPOC community. Okay. I think that is a problem, one, because of the segregation, because of the fragmentation of the state political structure. And so, it has been difficult. And so I found that, we have a very weak equity ecosystem in the state of Connecticut. You don't have as long of a tradition of Black and brown people really pushing up against the system to force it to make a lot of changes. The biggest effort, say over the last half century was a lawsuit that really kind of followed on the Brown decision to challenge segregation primarily in the greater Hartford area. So it wasn't even addressing segregation throughout the state. And that lawsuit has been sort of working its way through the system in various ways for almost 30 years. There was recently a settlement because even though a decision had been rendered decades ago, there was still little to no progress on addressing the segregation issues. And the original solution coming out of the first court decision was one that set up what they call a magnet school system in the greater Hartford area, right? And what it did was supposedly provide white parents from the surrounding, suburban communities some incentive to send their kids to schools in Hartford in exchange for providing Hartford children, mostly Black and brown, opportunities to then go to quote unquote better schools in the suburban towns outside of Hartford. Well, you can imagine, what happens. I remember going to the journalism, arts, and media school in Hartford, and then you're having the principal, a Black man, tell me that, they have all these empty seats at this school because white parents don't want to send their kids to this neighborhood. And then you have kids who literally live across the street from the school that can't go there. Right. So the recent settlement was supposed to have fixed some of that in terms of making sure that, children that live in Hartford have choices in terms of being able to go to surrounding school districts and providing more incentives, and so one of the things that has become a real interesting dynamic here in the state of Connecticut is how the so-called solutions in Connecticut are basically designed to incentivize white parents and to penalize school districts that are majority Black and brown. And so New Haven, for example, had been paying a fine literally for years because they did not have enough suburban students in their school system. Okay?
So taxing the people who actually need the resources.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. So it's pretty ludicrous. And there has been some attempt to address some of those issues, but it still, has a long way to go.
So David, a lot of what you're explaining to us is centered around racism. Let's just call it what it is. Right?
Absolutely.
So how does Graustein manage that? How do you go about in your role to manage and help change people's minds regarding people of color?
So we sit in the role of being able to provide support and resources for people who are working on these issues. We're not trying to take the leading role in this effort because we believe that really it is BIPOC communities that should be leading this charge. And, let's face it, even though I'm the executive director, this is still a white family foundation, okay? And we don't believe that it's really the role of white organizations and institutions to lead the, sort of anti-racism effort. Obviously, to be allies, to be in support. And so, we've made it very clear that people that are working to address these issues in different, ways can get support from us. And we will, serve to provide convening opportunities and resources for people that want to come together to do that. And that has been, I think, effective both in standing up some BIPOC efforts throughout the state. Probably the most successful up to this date was Black and Brown students organizing around the curriculum issues, because they were complaining that, look, how is it that as a Black or Brown student that I'm going, to this high school and I can't learn about my history, right? And they were the ones that led that charge. And to, get a state law passed requiring every high school to offer an elective. Now, you understand that that's barely even half a loaf, but it does highlight the problem in a significant way. And it did force the state education machinery to address that, because once the legislation passed, then the state education machinery had to put in place curriculum that was approved for all the school districts to use. Mm-hmm. And they basically included the people that pushed for the legislation in addressing that curriculum. So, we have provided some support for people who want to do that, but we really believe that it's important to make sure that, BIPOC people are in the leadership of these efforts.
Michelle, our history is still only an elective.
That's what I was going to say. That's amazing. What school district would say it's an elective to learn about Thomas Jefferson, right? What school district would take that position? But everything that's surrounding Thomas Jefferson involved Black people who were impacted by Thomas Jefferson. So how is it that we get to be an elective? It's so infuriating. And as an educator myself, I just, but anyway.
Absolutely. Well, but here's the other crazy part about that. So there is an elective that every school district has to offer. In the overwhelming majority of those school districts, no one's going to ask for that elective because there's so few BIPOC students in those communities. And if there are some, they would frankly be a little intimidated in even trying to push for that. And let's say that you had a school district where there was enough of a push. Most of those school districts don't have teachers equipped to teach such a class.
That's true too.
Right.
So the curriculum alone doesn't solve the problem.
So that'll conclude the first part of our conversation with Janella Hines, Princeton class of 1993, and David Adams, Princeton class of 1978, on education. Be sure to stay tuned for our next episode where we conclude our discussion.
If you enjoyed what you heard today, visit our website, NubianTigersPodcast.com. In addition to the podcast, we also post a resource page for each subject to provide additional sources of information. Follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @NubianTigers, written as one word. We're also on YouTube on the Nubian Tigers podcast channel. Our podcast is hosted by Anchor FM, but if you have a favorite podcast app, we're probably on it. Just look for the Nubian Tigers Talk. Looking forward to sharing some knowledge with you next time.
Wake up, wake up, wake up.